want to start with, in one place actually, Windows. So, Windows has been around forever and a day, it seems like. For us, it's obviously still the backbone for basically most of the personal computing market in terms of laptops and desktops, et cetera, et cetera. What caught my eye and it didn't just catch my eye, I also listened to it on a couple of podcasts that I was listening to about it, is this pursuit that Microsoft has about finding its next NT. So as a backtrack, of course, NT was something that was developed, or they started developing it fairly early on, even after Windows had been released, and it was intended to supplant as a superior technology that sort of underpinned Windows going forward. So it didn't really sort of get there until Windows XP. And I guess Windows had been around for 15 years at that point?
By that stage, yeah.
16 years. And the interesting thing is that they're releasing something called Windows 10X, or they're working on it, or whatever. I don't know too much about it other than their attempt to try and find this magical next NT, which essentially, for lack of a better term, is kind of like what iOS is for iPhone and iPad, where it's it ditches a lot of legacy sort of code, tries to sort of use apps that are more modern, et cetera, et cetera. But the interesting thing that I saw here was that they're planning on running all of these because they can't. The problem with Windows, obviously, historically, has been that they have to cater for the market with legacy apps. And how do they do that in a modern operating system that is supposedly not going to support it? And they're talking about running every individual app in its own container, which is really interesting. So they've already sort of started to try and do this in previous iterations. So I think there was Windows RT, I think, which
that's right,
was up there for a little while and disappeared almost as quickly during the Windows 8 era. But they seem to be making another attempt to go down this route, so that you could, in theory, run this Win32 app successfully, so a legacy app, for lack of a better term, and it will run it in its own container. It won't crash the operating system. It won't affect other apps, etc. And it'll be interesting to see if they can get there. It took about 15, 16 years for them to get NT up and running with XP. We're at about 15 or 16 years now since that came out. Well beyond that, I would say. Yeah. So maybe they're close to it. Hopefully they manage to do it as a first step, but I wonder if it's also the fact that they're still calling it Windows. Like, should they consider calling it something else so that people understand that it's something different, because maybe that will give them the impetus to sort of transition to a new platform.
Well, that's an interesting thought. You might be right on that one. I think what I find interesting about this is we talk about, we're post-PC, but until really the Mac OS and the Windows OS move on and become something new, we're still really in the PC age. You can't run apps collectively on either of your old legacy operating systems. So somewhere in the future, and we were promised this actually a long time ago, that everything would be app-based, but we've only seen that on the newer products, on the newer hardware.
Yeah.
So the question is how does this happen? And just getting onto the Chromebook, for instance, that's quite interesting, because that runs effectively Android and a browser, and effectively you can open Android apps on a Chromebook. I guess the issue is Google never quite gets these things right. If they had, they'd be way ahead of the pack.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting thing to see when you use a Chromebook, that effectively you're using a very tightly held operating system that accommodates these new generation of software applications. So the answer must be somewhere in the middle. And the truth is that it must be very difficult on an old-style PC, no matter how modern they are, to have an operating system that does all the high-level and powerful jobs that a powerful modern PC can do. and yet it can't work with these really simple apps.
Well, the thing I think that sort of is difficult for Microsoft in particular in this particular case, I guess it affects Apple as well, although they've got big success with iOS, etc. as a counterpoint. Whereas I think what it is that there might be an argument that the consumer is already in the post-PC world because, most consumers, if you look at their computing needs, they're probably a lot more basic than what anyone else is. So they could get away with, just using their phone, for instance, as their only computing device. Whereas the majority of the market, and particularly the majority of the market that Microsoft's serving, is enterprise, professional, etc. And then, the Mac has, a sliver of that as well in the sense of the creative professionals. They're starting to come back around to the, because Apple's pushing all its pro stuff, which we'll get to in a minute as well. But it seems as if until they can figure out a way to satisfy that enterprise customer, they're going to be stuck for a while.
Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting you say that, and especially the point about using a phone and a laptop, because that's actually what's merging.
Yeah. And
I had a really interesting conversation with a couple of colleagues the other night, and there really seems to be a trend amongst, I guess, professionals that's leaving out the tablet. The tablet is seen as a device for kids, and the modern professional uses a phone.
Yeah.
And anything bigger than that, they use a laptop.
Well, it makes sense. It makes sense because phones are huge now anyway. So
that's right. But you realise you're actually trying what the challenge, I guess, maybe from a consumer perspective is that Microsoft really needs to make its Surface run like a phone.
Yeah.
Not the other way around.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the days of, slide out keyboards and phones are all gone, I think.
Yeah, exactly.